Hello, welcome to another session of Philosophy Demystified. We're looking today at Skepticism. That's chapter 3, Knowledge and the Problem of Skepticism. It's in two parts. So today we're just going to look at the problems of skepticism, and then we're going to see some of the responses. I don't propose to do a whole heck of a lot of lecturing on the responses. I think I'm going to be looking more at getting you guys to maybe do a debate or something like that. Might be a little more interesting for you, because I know Zoom is starting to get us all a little worn down. I'm aware that some of you show up, but then, you're not behind your cameras, and attendance is getting lower. I mean, that's across the board. We know it's happening, but it affects us a lot in a small class. So anyway, hopefully after the half term, I'm told that we may well be able to get back into the classrooms, if indeed COVID cases remain at the negligible level that they are at, thankfully. We seem to be living in pretty much the best part of the world for dealing with this pandemic. And so, a lot to be grateful for. So on Wednesday, I went through the problem of skepticism, and whoa, am I having a stroke, or is it just the lights? I think what's happening is that there's cloud, and the natural lighting is going, adjusting to wherever the clouds are. So what is skepticism? I don't want to go on too long because most of you were at the lecture, and these things you're more likely to watch this if it's in a digestible size. So what does it mean to know something? Remember, we talked about the term epistemology, which is the philosophical, one of the founding pillars of philosophy, which is how do we know stuff? Because it's all very well to argue evidences and make arguments and so on, but unless we have a verifiable, a reliable method to know the results of our reasoning, then we're sort of left with this, everything being very tentative. And some folks say that, really that's the best that we can hope for when it comes to certain types of truths. They think with like mathematical truths, you can know things with certainty, all the way down to things like history or art, appraisals or literature, and they'll say, well, it's all completely relative. It's all just, you can't really know whether something is a good piece of work or not. It's all just relative. But then there are others that will argue forcefully for truth, beauty, and goodness as real and definable properties within things like history and art and literature and so on. And they'll say that, given certain criteria for what constitutes goodness, truth, and beauty, if say a piece of art or a piece of literature lives up to that standard, then we can say, yes, it is objectively good, true, and beautiful, and you can know that. And there's always a moral element to knowledge within the humanities, essentially saying that you have to be on a sort of even moral keel in order to be able to appreciate that which is true, that which is good, that which is beautiful. Others have insisted that is very narrow-minded. Others simply warn the dangers of believing that beauty is something always to be admired. They'll often say that beauty is one of the great deceptions of the world. It often lulls us into danger. But in any event, so what are the conditions necessary for knowledge? And the book on page 52, 53 begins to talk about it, saying, well, what has to be the case so that we can know something? Well, we have to. There's usually three elements. In order to know something, you have to first believe something is true. If you don't believe it's true, then how are you going to, come to any knowledge of something? But the claim itself that you believe is true has to actually be true. That's number two. And the third is you have to have reasonable justification for why you believe that thing to be true, which is true. So without all three of those, then you probably can't be said to have knowledge of it. The exception being things that we call properly basic beliefs, and I'll talk about them toward the end. Those are things, claims that can be known to be true and do not require any other evidence or justification for it. I'll give you an example. It is logically possible that we're all just brains in a vat, like a vat of chemicals being kept alive by a mad scientist who's stimulating the electrodes in our brain to make us think that we're perceiving all of this. We might all be human batteries in the Matrix. The problem is they'll say, well, prove that you're not. Prove that you're really experiencing this. And you say, well, I have an appreciation of the outside world. And they're like, everything that you would appeal to as evidence is actually part of the illusion. So, the outside world, your thoughts, logic, mathematics, all part of the illusion. So what philosophers have realized is that, okay, there are certain beliefs that we just call properly basic. It is a properly basic belief to believe that there is an outside world. You're not just a brain in the vat. And although we can't definitively prove otherwise, it is perfectly reasonable to say, look, I believe that there's an outside world, and I don't need to give any other corresponding evidence for that. It's simply the nature of the case that it's a reasonable belief. And then you can know that. So, but with other things, say like a murder trial, you have to both, believe the evidence has to be true, and you have to be able to give some justification for why you believe or take the position that you do. Remember, with a murder trial, say for instance, all the evidence points toward the guilt of the suspect, all the evidence that they have. Just because all the evidence points to it does not mean that the person is guilty. What I'm saying is that it is logically possible. There is a conceivable scenario where a person is innocent, but the evidence, for one reason or another, whether it's circumstantial or maybe he was framed or something of that regard, may point to him being guilty. So in this case, you believe he's guilty. There's evidence that he's guilty. So you've got 2 out of 3 of the claims to knowledge right there. But it turns out that the claim that he is guilty, it turns out not to be true. But that's a difficult scenario, because how do you know without evidence? So it seems to be the case that evidence is a crucial factor in how we know things to be true or false. But it's not infallible, because even evidence can be deceiving. I gave the example of the flat earth for that sometimes you can get people who can give you interesting evidence and arguments for a flat earth. And you may even come to believe that the earth is flat, but it remains the case in all likelihood that the claim that the earth is flat is not true, and that the evidence being given to you is in some way deceptive or insufficient, or it's relying on your kind of ignorance and lack of knowledge of how physics and so on work. I can think of one example that flat earthers use. They say, well, to prove the earth was round, they used to say, look at the ships and planes going over the horizon. And that proves that the earth is curved. Well, in actual fact, if you take the P90X camera and you look out and bring it into focus, you'll actually find the ships and planes coming back into focus, because it's just a matter of perspective. And then in actual fact, they're not going over the curve. They just appear to be going over the curve, because the further something gets away, even on a flat plane, the lower down it appears to get relative to our eye level. So that was like, see, there's the P90X, proves that the earth is flat. However, it doesn't, because in actual fact, even with the P90X, if it keeps going, eventually it does go over the horizon. So they only gave you a half-truth. They said, ships going over the horizon, visible to the naked eye, was a bad proof that the earth was round. That part is true. But they then turned around and said the P90X not only demolished that argument for a round Earth, but it proved the Earth was flat by simply bringing the ships back into focus again. But what it doesn't tell you is that even with the P90X, if it keeps going far enough, eventually even the P90X loses the thing over the curvature of the Earth. So that just goes to show how even evidence can be deceptive sometimes. I also mentioned in sort of trials, what is the standard for knowledge in terms of evidence? With civil cases, usually the sort of thing that civil trials, they don't involve prison. They're in things like contesting wills, personal injury, that sort of thing. In order to prove the case, they only need to prove it on the balance of probabilities. So it's 51% more probable than not that the respondent caused injury or is responsible monetarily to the person making the claim. Whereas with crime, things that you could be imprisoned for, they demand a much higher burden of proof because of the claims over your freedom, the reputation loss, and so on. So it has to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, what is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? What is reasonable in this case? And we've seen that it's to a level where if you're on the jury, you have to say, well, I have to be sure that the person is guilty. So what is sure? Well, as sure as you were when you decided to get married, or decided what college to go to, or decided what job or profession to pursue. That level. So there is a bit of risk involved. You're not absolutely certain that you're not going to end up getting divorced, or that you might not find employment, or you might go to medical school and find out you weren't smart enough to remember all those big words. But you're fairly sure at the time. That's the level of surety that you need to have in order to claim knowledge sufficient to convict in a criminal trial. And anything less than that, you're obliged to plead not guilty. Remember the example I gave of that prof who told us about the time he was a foreman in a rape trial. It was a very unpleasant case. So again, trigger warning. He said that he did a trial where a lady had been picked up by a guy in a car in a bar. I can't remember if it was a car or a bar, but she was taken against her will to a rock quarry and was raped and quite brutally, and then left for dead. And she went to the police. They picked up the guy. His DNA was all over her. It was a pretty open and shut case. And so when it went to the jury, they did a vote right at the beginning, and 11 out of 12 had voted guilty right off the bat. And there was one holdout. And this prof, who was the foreman, asked whoever it was to speak up, and this lady spoke up, and she said, "Well, I'm just not sure, because it's possible that aliens could have impersonated this guy and taken this woman and had sex with her, and the DNA is just they made their DNA look like his." The rest of the people wanted to laugh, but this foreman who taught philosophy realized he was just going to lose her. She would dig her heels in if he didn't, try to take her objection seriously, and explain to her that reasonable doubt does not mean no doubt at all. And he proceeded to explain, what it means to be sure on the basis of getting married or something like that. And once she realized that, any scenario that she could imagine is not grounds for saying not guilty. It has to be, there is a standard to apply. She eventually pleaded guilty, and the guy was convicted. Okay, so an obstacle to knowing is this thing called skepticism. Skepticism is usually where it challenges the third leg. So the first leg was you have to believe it's true. The second is the claim has to be true. And the third is you have to have reasonable evidence in support of why you believe that this claim is true. And what skepticism does is it attacks that third. It always says that either the evidence is false or it's insufficient to justify you coming to believe that the evidence for this particular claim is true. So to take the obvious example of God's existence, a person may believe God exists, and and believe they have evidence for it, and the skeptic will say the evidence is not sufficient. They may even acknowledge that it may well be the case that God exists, but they would say if God exists, even if God exists, it doesn't provide sufficient evidence to make it rational for you to believe that God exists. And we see that skeptics often have very strange levels of evidence as to what they require. Some seem to take the position that if God exists, then he should chisel, I made this on the moon. But that doesn't seem to comport with at least what the Bible says God will do. God says, I've given you sufficient evidence, but they don't want to override a person's free will by making it so obvious. Others, skeptics sometimes reply that people who believe in God keep making these excuses for the lack of evidence, of physical evidence for the existence of God. But for those that say God is pure spirit and not a physical being that lives in the universe, they would tell skeptics, well, requiring, us to be able to look through a telescope and see God in the heavens is not proof God doesn't exist when God isn't a physical being. And they would say that instead God has left signs of his existence through the evidence of order and logic and balance in the universe. There's a mathematician out of the University of Oxford, John Lennox, who says the very fact that we can do science points to the existence of an intelligent designer, because the universe is supremely finely balanced. It is intelligible. You can study it. Mathematics, for some God only knows reason, mathematics seems to support and accurately describe the structure of the universe. The world seems to be made of numbers, in other words. And so he says that alone seems to suggest that there is a divine mind that uses numbers to create reality. Whereas some skeptics would say, well, not really. They'll say the universe just happens to be made of numbers. It doesn't mean that there's a divine mind behind it. Some skepticism is warranted. Sometimes the claim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is a kind of a famous quote. But sometimes you say, well, okay, an extraordinary claim is what, like a miracle? And a skeptic would say, yeah. And they say, well, you can't believe in the miracle unless there's like another miracle to prove that miracle. And I go, well, then you'd need another miracle to prove that miracle. And they'd say, well, precisely, which just goes to show you can never believe in God. So that level, to me, that is just sort of demonstrating a presupposition on the part of the skeptic. He's saying no amount of evidence could ever convince him that God exists. So it's not really about evidence. It's more an autobiographical statement about the skeptic who's saying, look, I will never, ever allow there to be a God. Even if God exists, I have adopted a standard of evidence that makes it impossible for anyone to ever demonstrate this God's existence. Even if God himself, there's a famous atheist who said, even if God himself appeared in front of me and said, I'm here, and shook me, I would assume I was hallucinating or on drugs or had developed schizophrenia. He would never believe it. So that's a pretty high standard. And so that's what I wanted to raise this distinction between skepticism as a tool and skepticism as a worldview. Skepticism as a tool is a valuable tool because it keeps us from getting fooled by liars and deceivers, who are sometimes other people, like trying to sell us a dud car, like a used car salesman, or even deceiving ourselves. Sometimes we have to be skeptical of our own thoughts and feelings and realize that our emotions aren't always reliable indicators of reality. And we should be skeptical of our own thoughts and test our thoughts. Test the spirits, as it were. But skepticism as a worldview is, I think, can be limiting. Limiting in terms of it limits what's possible. As I said, if somebody who's a professional skeptic isn't really someone, it seems, who's out to find the truth. It seems that professional skeptics are often out to debunk things that don't fit with their worldview. So you'll get professional skeptics like Michael Shermer or the Amazing Randy, or they're sort of professional atheists professional disbelievers in anything paranormal, and they will just always rip apart evidence for phenomena and will just refuse to accept anything, no matter where the evidence seems to go. And, because we know that very few things in life can be known with absolute certainty, there's always an objection that they can raise and just say, well, that's not enough evidence, or this isn't good evidence. But what's also funny about these professional skeptics is that they're very selective in the topics that they require overwhelming evidence for. Like, you'll find them very skeptic of things like clairvoyance or psychic ability, to the point where, they'll just dismiss 100 cases of psychic ability documented in peer-reviewed literature. But if they happen to have a lot of trust in their doctors or something, they won't require much any corroborative evidence. If their doctor says, okay, you should do this, or you should take a vaccine, or you should I don't know, any example is going to be controversial in and of itself, climate change or something like that, they'll just put their trust. So what it says is that professional skeptics don't really have a problem with authority. It just, they will not recognize the authority of people that say things that they don't tend to believe in. So if some scientists begin to say there's evidence for life after death, or evidence that the consciousness survives the death of the brain, they'll say, no, that's not possible. Don't respect your authority. You're not authoritative. But if it's a different kind of scientist who says, take vitamin D, it helps stave off COVID-19, well, they have no problem with that authority, so they won't be skeptical of that claim. So really, a lot of times, skepticism is good, testing things like when they just say, okay, the mind can survive the death of the brain. Well, we should test that. But there is a lot of evidence coming out on that, and gradually science is changing its view of some of these claims. We've discovered now that the United States and Russia have been studying paranormal phenomena since at least the 1940s, and seeing how they could weaponize things like remote viewing and being able to spy on people using their minds and all that sort of stuff, and mind control. That there's an element of truth to some of these things, and some of these professional skeptics are having to back off on some of these claims that they used to just dismiss, because there's now sort of, the authority is now entering the mainstream a little bit more, and so they're respecting the authorities a little more when they say that there's some evidence in support of these things. So there's two kinds of skepticism. There's pyrrhic and academic. The softer skepticism will kind of say, well, I don't know, and I'm a little bit wary about making any hard claims to knowledge on certain ideas. Whereas the hard skeptic will say, I don't know, and you can't know either. It can't be known. So therefore, we have to always just be relativistic. We have to always just say we're not certain, we don't really know. But there's always this fundamental assumption that you can't know something for certain is the equivalent of saying that thing isn't true. That's the bit you've got to watch out for. That you've got to watch out for people saying, I challenge your ability to know this is true, is not simply their weaselly way of saying it's false. I believe it to be false. And that's why I'm saying you can't know. You got to test the skeptic a little bit and ask the skeptic, well, if you're skeptical of everything, shouldn't you be skeptical of your own skepticism? It's funny how dogmatic, though, you find so many skeptics to be on anything related to philosophy, religion, paranormal, that sort of stuff. So, okay, the book lists 4 kinds of skepticism, and I think there's basically 2, because Plato's cave and unreliable sense experience are almost the same thing. Plato's cave is the metaphor for describing unreliable sense experience, and the evil genius and dream argument are virtually the same thing. The evil genius and dream argument are basically that what we think we know about the world may not be true. It might all be a dream, because you go into dreams and sometimes dreams appear real, and how do you know we're not dreaming right now? The other side of it is maybe an evil genius has deluded you through drugs or mind control or something to believe what you see of the outside world, and it might not actually be real. There may be an evil god, say, making you perceive the world in a way that is false. All right. The unreliability of sense experience says, things like optical illusions and so on demonstrate that our senses aren't always reliable. Indeed, Darwin's own argument said that if naturalism is true, naturalism being the belief that everything in life is just reducible to atoms and there's no God or creative spirit or anything like that, and that just pure blind evolution is true, you have no way of relying upon your senses to know that what you know is accurate about reality, because according to the Darwinian thesis, our brain will not be geared toward truth of how the world actually is. It will be geared toward survival and reproduction. So if it happens to be the case at any one time that believing a lie about nature or about your outside world is in some way beneficial to survival and reproduction, then your brain is going to lie to you and you're going to not know the world as it actually is. And he was worried about that. He said, if it turns out that I'm just a monkey, how do I know that anything I know as a monkey is true, including my own theory of evolution? So he said there was a potential for it to sort of defeat itself. Plato's cave, if you recall, I've spoken about this a couple of times, is the metaphor of the unreliability of sense experience. Plato thought of this thing. He said, this is the problem. We can hypothesize and think about things, but there seems to be this disconnect between how we perceive the world through our senses and how the world perhaps really is. And he says it's as though we are people who are chained up inside of a cave, looking and chained and facing the wall. And behind us out there is the real world. Outside of the cave is the real world. But we don't see the real world because we can't turn around and we can't go outside. All we can see is the fact that there is a campfire that is burning, and it's throwing shadows, flickering shadows of what's going on out in the real world. It's throwing shadows up on the wall at the back of the cave, and that's all we can see. So we can see shadows of reality, but not reality itself. And he said, St. Paul said that we see through a glass darkly. And it is this fundamental problem that we have where we go, we seem to be discerning that our senses don't always give us accurate information about the world. Ironically, that's what the flat earthers say. They say, your senses tell you that you should trust your senses. That, it doesn't feel like you're spinning on a huge ball, does it? It feels like the earth is stationary. But what science has apparently told us is our faculties, our sense experience isn't accurate here. Apparently we're spinning around at thousands of miles an hour and going through the vacuum of space. And yet we don't feel it. To us, it feels like we're stationary. So in that sense, they argued that that's a great example of Plato's cave. Our senses tell us that we're stationary and that the earth, there's no curvature and all this sort of thing. But what apparently science tells us is that our sense experience was not accurate here. That reality is, in actual fact, the earth is curved, but that you can know that if you study, if you have sort of esoteric knowledge. But, it said you have to be skeptical of your own sense experience in this situation. And that's why some people struggle with it. They go, well, why? Because it seems like they have to just believe the authority of scientists and who are telling them that their senses are lying to them. But that's why people have gone on videos and tried to make videos to try to explain why you can know that the earth is round, even though it doesn't appear to be, simply by looking around and not feeling any motion beneath your feet. Okay, so that is a quick summation in 30 minutes of what Chapter 3 is all about. I hope you find that useful. I'm available on email for any clarifications that you might need. And I look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday. Take care now. Ciao, ciao.